Random noises. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream. My name is Manar Adli, and I am the founder and director of MIT Press News and Behind the Headlines. I'm joined today by our senior staff writer and investigative journalist, Ellen McLeod, and Mickey Huff. He's the director of Project Censored. He's the president of the Media Freedom Foundation, and he is co-editor of Project Censor's State of the Free Press's annual book on censored news stories, which we're going to talk about today, and co-author of United States of Distraction, Media Manipulation in Post-Truth America, just to name a few. We're also joined by Colleen Rowley. She is an FBI whistleblower turned activist, turned anti-war activist. He's done a lot of work with Women Against Military Madness. And I'm just very honored and excited to have everybody join us today. Thank you, everybody, for being here with me. There is a slight echo. So you guys, I don't know if it's coming from Mickey or Colleen, but if you guys can just mute yourselves briefly. And then when it's your turn to talk, you can unmute yourself. Just that will help the echo. So I'm not going to lie, I'm quite exhausted talking about Gaza, and I can only imagine the horror and exhaustion that the people in Gaza are feeling every single day. I can't believe that it's day 69 of Israel's genocide in Gaza, and the media doesn't even have the journalistic integrity to call it what it is, a genocide, ethnic cleansing. The Western corporate media ignore the genocidal admissions by Israeli generals and politicians who openly call for the wiping out of every single human being in Gaza. The Western corporate media pretend not to know where the missiles come from that are raining down on Gaza. I just released a video tribute and dedication of an award that I have just received from the Women's Institute of the Freedom of the Press for the journalists in Gaza, both fallen and the ones who are against all odds still alive in Gaza. 85 journalists have been killed in Gaza, and you'd think the Western corporate media reporters would have something to say about this, but their silence is deafening. And of course, when they do cover these journalists' death, they pretend not to know how they were killed or why they were killed. And they fail to mention that Israel is systematically targeting them, taking them out one by one, an admission by Israeli generals. We didn't forget the Western corporate media's silence on the imprisonment and persecution of Julian Assange, which we're going to talk about today. And we will certainly not forget their silence and turning a blind eye to Israel's systematic targeting of Gaza's brightest and best, who have been taken out one by one along with their families. Once again, just like with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the regime change operations in Libya and Syria, the complete starvation of 23 million Yemenis, the 6 million Congolese that have already died, these atrocities and tragic and horrific events were all made possible by Western corporate media. And it had everything to do with how they framed these stories and dehumanized the victims of our war. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is, we're day 69 into this genocide. And for those who turn to Mint Press News, media propaganda is not a new concept. It's what we specialize in exposing. And so what better than to have these three experts join us today. Alan, I want to start by asking you about some of the latest headlines in question by mainstream corporate media from this week in particular, where the US was once again the lone country along with Israel and a few Pacific Islander countries that wouldn't even call for a ceasefire. Canada is now calling for a permanent ceasefire after a long week of supporting, or not a week, but a long 2 months of supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza.
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, This is a very common pattern at the UN. The United States likes to think it is a shining city on the hill, a leader of the free world, uh, a country that other countries take their cues from. But really, when we look at the long, long list of votes at the United Nations, we see that the United States is so very often an outlier state. It's quite rare, actually, that they are siding with the majority, and very often they are in the extreme minority when it comes to things like making a food a human right, or respecting indigenous titles to the land, or anything to do with banning weapons or anything like that. The United States is really out on one edge of the entire world. And when it comes to Israel or Palestine, it's the same thing. The United States, far from being a leader in the peace process, is actually blocking peace. As you said, the United Nations continually tries to push for ceasefires in the General Assembly. These things are voted against by the United States. And of course, the real teeth of the United Nations lies in the Security Council. And just recently, they had a vote. It went 13-1 to 1. And that was a vote in favor of a permanent ceasefire. The United States was the only country voting against it. And because the United States is one of the few countries at the UN, along with Britain, France, China, and Russia, that has a veto at the United Nations, the resolution did not get passed. And so, therefore, we have a situation where the United States is blocking international efforts to actually alleviate the suffering of Palestinians, while at the same time claiming that they are really the neutral party in all of this. And you just put that amazing Fox News headline up on the screen there. That's what I was talking about. The United States, as I said, was the sole party blocking this ceasefire at the UN Security Council. But then Fox News runs with the headline, UN rejects resolution calling for immediate ceasefire in Gaza. And as I said, of course, it wasn't the UN rejecting it. It was only the United States. But if you only rely on skimming through headlines, which most Americans do, including, probably most of us and most of us watching, we very often just are scrolling through our social media feeds, whether it's Instagram, Twitter, whatever, and we read the headline and we move on. What would we get from that headline? The headline says that the United Nations is against a ceasefire, which is completely and utterly incorrect. The entire world, it seems, pretty much without barely any exceptions, is very much supportive of peace. It's actually only the Israeli government and a few people in Washington that want this conflict to continue. And unfortunately, the media is playing along with that.
Well, and I want to talk about the United States standing on the global stage. So this question is for you, Colleen. I mean, humanity has spoken quite loudly and clearly that they oppose this genocide in Gaza. They want Israel to end its occupation, its brutal occupation. I mean, we're looking at really horrific numbers where, over 20,000 civilians have died, 10,000 children have died. It hurts to even say these numbers because it's just so unimaginable what these families have gone through. And it's like we're being gaslit. We're being gaslit by the establishment. We have world leaders, pay lip service to people by talking about human rights. They've weaponized the concept of human rights and democracy while literally handing Israel the very weapons, the missiles, the bombs, the satellites, the drones to kill Palestinians. So talk to me about the United States standing on the world stage right now amid this genocide. Oh, you are muted, I think, still.
At least in the press conference that the State Department spokesperson gives every day, it was Matt Miller, and he was questioned pretty vociferously by, I think it was AP guy, Matt Lee, an old guy, about how can the United States claim that it's continuing to maintain its leadership of the world when, in fact, it was the only country to vote against this ceasefire. And he asked this more than once. Now, the answer back from the State Department spokesperson was was ridiculous in some ways, and you could almost see some of the other reporters roll their eyes. But he basically said, everyone that I talk to in the world reveres the United States and looks up to us as the leader of the world. That was his answer back. Maybe he's living in a bubble, but that's gone on. And at least that was a sign that some of the reporters in the room now are understanding that how can you claim to be the leader when in fact you are the outlier that's voting against this. And when most of the people are able to go on to alternate media, and as you say, it's just unbelievable, sad, and almost traumatic to watch what's going on in Gaza. And people are finding this out, even though our mainstream press is still very skewed. And the worst thing on the mainstream press that I saw in the last couple of days was they took that exchange between Representative Elise Stefanik, who herself is, shown herself to be bigoted in a whole bunch of different ways, but she flipped on its head with the 3 university presidents. And of course, the thing here is the genocide of the people living in Gaza. That's the issue. And she flipped it on its head and said, well, what if people were calling for a genocide of Jewish people? Now, that's a complete hypothetical. And these you would think the 3 college presidents would have had the wherewithal to answer back and say, that's not what did you doing? You're making up a hypothetical straw man, and I'm not going to answer that. That's what they should have said. But instead, they fell into the trap. Then our mainstream media has used that to distract and make it, again, they flipped this whole genocide issue on its head, flipped it upside down to make Israelis be the victims. Which, it's pretty obvious, but, most people, as Alan just said, they are watching these news coverages. They don't really think, it's just what plays really quick for 2 seconds. And so that's where we're at, I think.
Well, and social media has played a really critical role in helping shape people's understanding of what's happening in Gaza. So we have to give some credit to people's ability to share information across these social media platforms. In a way, people online have put pressure on big, the so-called legacy media outlets to cover Palestine properly. And they have. I've seen a major shift in the coverage. People are protesting in front of the offices of the New York Times, of CNN. We gave up on Fox News a long time ago, but at least there's that pressure in front of the BBC as well. And so they're being forced to change the way they're covering this. Whereas when the Iraq war was taking place, all we had was the corporate mainstream media and mass protests. And so there was kind of like, there was something missing. And so I want to ask you, Mickey, about how WikiLeaks has helped shape corporate media understanding of wars and how that has transformed today into social media activism.
Thanks, Minar. It's nice to be here with such erudite and courageous folks, journalists, activists. It's of course not nice or not wonderful to be here to talk about this subject, which is, I think we're entering stages where we're going to need new words to describe things. And I know Alan McLeod does a really excellent job analyzing the ways in which the corporate media really gaslight us with their headlines and euphemisms and manipulation of terms. And, in a lot of ways, Minar, Julian Assange, who is still rotting in a Belmarsh prison for the crime of being a publisher and committing acts of journalism, he's been there long. He's been sitting in prison waiting for a trial or really a kangaroo court extradition to the United States, where he faces charges on the Espionage Act. He's not even a U.S. citizen. this is an ongoing travesty and an assault on press freedoms that have worldwide implications. And a lot of what, by the way, at Project Censored, we also run the Censored Press with our partner, Seven Stories Press. We published one of the only books on the case this last year. It's called Guilty of Journalism, the case against Julian Assange, the political case against Julian Assange by the reporter Kevin Gosztola, whom your audience ought to know. If they don't, they certainly should. Kevin's work at Shadowproof and The Dissenter. He's not only chronicled the case, but cataloged in the back of the book just a quick list even of 30 or so reasons why we really need to remember and revere WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. And it's because some of what we know from these leaked documents from the US and from other governments around the world does involve Israel, does involve apartheid, does involve strategies and policies to suppress Palestine. It clearly involves machinations and plans to divert attention, distract, and distort coverage. There's also a lot in our analysis, Manar, that WikiLeaks has confirmed that clearly show that Western media outlets have a rather extraordinary establishment bias, where they determine the news, not only the newsworthy nature of who merits being covered, but how. And in the process, riffing on the propaganda model from Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky going back over 30 years, one of the things they talked about was the concept, the Orwellian concept of persons or unpersons. And the people of Palestine fall into this Orwellian designation of unpersons, that they somehow are subhuman or less human. And as Aldous Huxley reminded us, that's one of the key goals of propaganda, is to convince populations that people are less than human. So atrocities can occur and seemed not only justified, but heroic. And that's the kind of distortion that we see in a lot of the Western press. We saw it in Ukraine. We're seeing it again now, even more fully. In fact, Zelensky just came to Washington and they're like, what, who are you? No money for you. So anyway, just to close that thought, the way in which that they determine the corporate media what's newsworthy also applies to victims. Who is a worthy victim or an unworthy victim? We've seen an incredible number of journalists assaulted, killed. You mentioned earlier, Manar, over 80. The Reporters Without Borders just released their report for this year, and they only have a little over half that number being killed worldwide. So they're not even including all those numbers because they're happening in such extraordinary, tragic real time. I don't know exactly all the reasons, but as Andy Roth and I at Project Censored say, the world doesn't stop for us to take its temperature, and we can't even keep track of the numbers of the tragedies that are happening here. And another part of that reason is because the Palestinian people have been deemed to be unworthy of Western coverage, of Western empathy. And, until we really address that, Manar, the kind of coverage we see isn't going to change. Now, you're right to say that corporate coverage has slightly changed, and they have had to acknowledge some of the empirical information on the ground coming out of Gaza. I mean, or else they'd have less than no integrity. Right now, they're hovering at near no integrity. But that's why we rely on the alternative and independent press. And at Project Censored, we've been chronicling the underreported stories about Gaza for decades. And Andy Roth and I have compiled those. We've had those lists at our site. And you can see some of the pieces that we've published, both at Project Censored, at Truth Out, and on our program, where we just had Abby Martin on talking about this. Manar, you've been on. So I think alternative independent media is really plays a huge role in this, where Assange really played a major role in helping to buttress alternative media outlets. They had a relationship because it was only a lot of the independent outlets that were publishing a lot of what WikiLeaks was trying to get out. And while the corporate media might cherry pick it to win awards, they simultaneously threw Assange under the bus, and they remained largely silent about his imprisonment until recently. So there's a lot of this kind of complicity going on, Manar, and a lot of it does go back to who controls the media, who controls those narratives, and what we can do about it. And we need more critically media literate people. We need more intrepid independent journalists, and we need people covering it from the ground up where the war crimes are taking place.
Absolutely. And I just, going along with your theme of unworthy and worthy victims, we have this really powerful, I'm going to get it up on the screen right now, headline. I believe it's from the Washington a Wall Street Journal. So one second, I'm going to share this. And this headline really symbolizes the gaslighting that we're experiencing within mainstream corporate media. I mean, how can a headline like this make it to one of the largest newspapers in this country? Of course, it is the Wall Street Journal. What was that? Oh,
Menard, let's retire the practice, not the term.
So yeah, so we're trying to understand how could such a headline make it to a mainstream outlet, but then again, we know the mainstream media's agenda. I mean, this is the Wall Street Journal that we are talking about, but this headline reads, "Is it time to retire the term genocide?" with the little excerpt here explaining, "From Capitol Hill to the Middle East, a word invented to describe the ultimate crime has become a political flashpoint." Now, I didn't read the article, nor would I probably have to know what this person is trying to argue. But the agenda is very clear here, which is to remove the significance of the word genocide, which is what Israel is doing to Palestinians. It's what Palestinians are experiencing at the hands of Israel. They are being genocided. And we know this for a fact because we've heard the words coming out of the mouths of people like Israeli General Yoav Gallant, who called every single person in Gaza, including babies, women, children, I mean, every single person, of needing to be cut off from electricity, water, shelter. Nobody is safe from this, from the Israeli bombs. We've heard the words coming out of the mouths of Israeli elected officials who have referred to all people of Gaza as subhuman, people of the darkness, Amlak. And so these are genocidal statements. And as I said in my intro, our media is pretending. I know they can hear those calls of genocide. They are completely pretending to that they don't exist, to manufacture consent and to frame Palestinians as those unworthy victims. You know, I grew up living under Israeli occupation and apartheid for 4 years, and I witnessed the brutality of Israel's occupation and military. And I was just there this summer for the first time in 18 years. And it was truly a horrific scene to see the apartheid wall, to see the Israeli military, which, by the way, is run by teenagers. It's young Israelis that are forced to enlist in the military, but they are there and they do see Palestinians as subhuman. And they are very much trigger happy from all of the images and videos that we see coming out of even the West Bank, where children are being assassinated. How many soldiers? There's a joke now. How many soldiers does it take out a Palestinian child? Because you'll see a Palestinian child running down the street, and there's literally like 10 soldiers running after him with their rifles. It's really, really disturbing stuff. But Alan, if you could talk to us about this headline that I just shared, "Is it time to retire the term genocide from Capitol Hill to the Middle East, a word invented to describe the ultimate crime has become a political flashpoint." What do you think the agenda is here with this?
Well, first of all, I think the absolute fundamental thing about corporate media is that they are not plucky truth tellers trying to hold the powerful to account. Far from it, they are in fact the voice of the powerful. Corporate media is very often part of gigantic multinational corporations owned by multi-billionaires who have a very specific agenda at play. And their agenda is preserving the status quo, whether that's capitalism, imperialism, the US domination of the world. The Wall Street Journal, of course, owned by Rupert Murdoch, News Corp, one of the one of the richest, most influential, and frankly, one of the most venal billionaires who has ever walked this planet. Rupert Murdoch has all sorts of connections to the Israeli government and the Israeli project of forcing Palestinians from their home. And so when we're reading something like that in the Wall Street Journal, we really have to have our critical media literacy thinking caps on. And what this headline really says is that a lot of people who are in the sort of intellectual bubble of the Wall Street Journal, the people in Washington and New York and London, are starting to get worried that what they're seeing on social media and everywhere, or even in the streets where they live, are hundreds of thousands of people rejecting Israeli genocide and saying a ceasefire now. And they're getting worried that this term is actually making their project, which they support, of Israeli colonization, look extremely bad, because genocide is really the ultimate crime that humans can do to each other. And of course, this isn't simply a factual statement of, is genocide the incorrect term to use here? As you laid out, Manar, Israeli officials are using genocidal language and telling you what their plans are. We've seen members of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, talk about how this is the Nakba 2023, referencing the genocide of 1948, where 750,000 Palestinians were forced at gunpoint from their homes to make the initial creation of the state of Israel viable in terms of it being a Jewish supremacist state. We've seen Israeli officials talk about how the plan is to force the population of Gaza, which, let's remember, is more than 2 million people packed into a space which is smaller than Mobile, Alabama. More than 2 million people forced into what she called a tent city in the Sinai Desert in Egypt. From there, the refugees are supposed to be taken to any country that will take them, whether that's Ireland or Scotland or any of the Arabian countries like Yemen or Jordan. This is an absolute textbook case of genocide. I mean, we have the 1948 Genocide Convention, which lays out what genocide is. It's not just killing people indiscriminately. It is also forcing people permanently off their land, like so many of the Western countries did, like the founders of the United States did to the indigenous population there to establish the United States. So this is really a textbook case of genocide. But why this is coming up in intellectual think pieces is because they don't like this. They're feeling uncomfortable. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance going on here, that they have been brought up their whole lives thinking genocide is bad, but now they're having to support the Israeli government doing this to Palestine. And so how do they deal with that? They say, let's just stop talking about it. And frankly, I think that's about as deep as this article goes in terms of intellectually.
Well, and I think something that, when we look at like our elected officials here in the US and the many elected officials in the UK who continuously refuse to call for a ceasefire, all you hear them say is, Israel has a right to defend itself, by any means possible. They have no red lines because we have to defeat this evil enemy of Hamas. And these elected officials are pushing atrocity propaganda. Much of it has been retracted by the Israeli military itself. The 40 beheaded baby story, which was used to justify Israel's bombardment of Gaza. That was like the focal point. That was the narrative. That was retracted by the White House. They said they could not confirm that happened. The Israeli military has come out and said that we cannot provide evidence that has happened. And yet that narrative, that story is being pushed. Now, the last time we did a live stream, it had been several weeks since the White House had retracted that, and the Israeli military had come out and said that they cannot prove that. And that morning, and I don't have the link with me right now, but I'm sure we can Google this really quickly, Politico had published an article with the first line stated, "When those 40 Jewish babies were buried." A blatant lie. That's how the media gets away with it. They push the atrocity propaganda, they push the fake news, and they have the audacity to target independent journalists who go so far as to try to verify these stories, and they call us, Hamas sympathizers or whatever they want to call us. Another story that was retracted were the babies being baked in ovens. All of these stories are atrocity propaganda. I can't say it enough. They're just atrocity propaganda to pull at the heartstrings of people. And it's to frame Palestinians and Hamas as these barbaric people that deserve to be bombed. And that's the narrative that we're seeing in the comment sections as well. When you look at the conversations happening about Palestine and Israel, is that there are the people like us who can see through the propaganda, who know the truth, what's going on. And then there's the people who are like on the other side, who are consuming mainstream corporate media, and they believe every single line that comes out of the mouth of Benjamin Netanyahu, who himself is a war criminal. They believe the lies that come out of the mouth of our very own president, who claimed he saw 40 pictures of 40 beheaded babies, and his handlers at the White House had to actually retract that and say, no, he did not. And so we're seeing this, very disconnect when it comes to people on the other side that are falling for the propaganda. And we're seeing these elected officials who purport to be representing we the people, but they don't, because I believe the numbers are now out that over 70% of Americans do support a ceasefire. And yet we have 70% of our elected officials not calling for a ceasefire. So there's a major disconnect between these so-called representatives and the people that vote them into office. And I was just watching a video from Medea Benjamin, who is one of the founders of Code Pink. She's an activist, and she's reporting that not only do so many elected officials have the Israeli flag outside of their office, like, wow, but they have put up barricades inside the halls of Congress and at senators' offices to prevent activists from protesting near them and asking them to call for a ceasefire. Our beloved, and he's not my beloved, but I know he's the beloved of many, Bernie Sanders, he has locked his door for the first time in his Senate history, and it's because of his supporters putting pressure on him to call for a ceasefire. He has completely abandoned his base, and all he's calling is for a temporary ceasefire to allow for a humanitarian pause, I should call it, humanitarian pause. And his supporters are not buying it. They're calling him out. And so we have people, elected officials, who have run under the ticket of the Democratic Party, who have done a good job for many years, talking a really nice talk about human rights and socialism and equality. And yet they are the very people who are allowing this atrocious genocide to continue. And Colleen, if you will, can you talk a little bit about the activism that you have been doing locally here in Minneapolis? And then also, what is your feedback? You've worked in the intelligence community as an FBI agent, and just looking at just the Democrats in general, just the Democratic Party is really, the veil has been lifted. For those who ever thought the Democrats had an ounce of humanity in them, the veil has been lifted.
Yeah, and I will admit that I actually even ran here for Congress as a Democrat back in 2006. Very embarrassed and ashamed that I fell into that rather than trying to be an independent, which I am now. And at the time that I ran for Congress in 2005 and 6, some of the main leaders now in Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar, who recently ran for president, Governor Walz, who actually ran and won Congress that same year with me, and who else? It was Walz, Ellison, who's now the Minnesota Attorney General. So there's all these people that were actually running as Democrats when I was. And one thing that it was very noticeable that when the media was trying to portray this as a war, that's one of the propaganda techniques, is picking a term. So a war entitles both sides, etc. Well, actually, it's a genocide. It's not a war. The Gazans have no air force or anything like that to fight back, and they're trapped. So it's merely a genocide. So when I realized, when you saw this at the start, I quickly went to work and painted all of these red "Stop the Genocide" signs, one of which is a big long banner that we can hold over the interstate. I don't know if you have a picture of this, but we hold it over 6 or 7 lanes of traffic. We counted at different times at least 10,000 cars and there's 2 different directions, so that makes 20,000 cars. And then if there's any additional passengers, we kind of figure 30,000 people in an hour. That kind of rivals what you can do with a podcast or other things. So these are very simple, low budget things, but we go with this big red "Stop the Genocide." And some of that is to keep the conversation, keep that word. Because if you lose the word genocide, just as Noam Chomsky and others have written about, and you go back to what they were trying to say, which is war. Now, in Germany, for instance, I think it's illegal. I think you can't say "Stop the Genocide." I don't think you can hold a sign, "Stop the Genocide." And they're trying to, so they've had to resort to hard censorship. And as you know, Rep. Stefanik and others have tried to say, they're trying to claim that people who want to stop genocide are the ones who want to commit genocide. You know, they're just trying to flip it completely around. And our media goes along with that. But yeah, in Minnesota, we've done some low-tech things. Yesterday, we took the "Stop the Genocide" signs into there. There's the "Stop the Genocide" sign that someone climbed up 2 stories and posted on the wall, outside wall of Senator Klobuchar's building. And that's me in there holding "Ceasefire." And then there's one, hopefully there's another photo showing where we hold it over all of the traffic. Yesterday, we went into Governor Walz's office with the same sign. And here's the thing in Minnesota, which is, you know, you say, aren't you worried about your legacy? In Minnesota, in that state capital, up until maybe 10, 15 years ago, many of the paintings were of the genocide of the Native Americans. Minnesota has had to even revise its state seal and its state flag because a lot of this rested upon governors who had committed massacres, like Governor Ramsey was one. And they've had to walk this back now and say, we maybe should even stop naming counties after Ramsey because he was so bad. So there's been, it's taken 120 years for this to finally, people to realize. There's the one over the interstate. So people in Minnesota have recognized that this was a horrible thing, what they did to the indigenous population in Minnesota back in the late 1880s and et cetera, and during the Civil War. And Governor Walz's deputy governor is herself a Native American. So when you go into the Capitol now, all of the paintings have been switched to Civil War or Revolutionary War, but not showing the suppression of the Indians. I think this is important because you're seeing history repeating now, and the same people that are so indignant about Minnesota's history that they've had to change the state flag and the state seal, rename our lakes. That's what the one lake was renamed. So they've had to do this, and now they're still going along and pushing for another one. Anyways, we tried to get that message, but all we could talk to was a receptionist, and we got one TV channel to cover it.
Wow. No, you guys are doing amazing work. I've been, seeing a lot of the actions taking place here in Minneapolis. And I do think that, we are making a difference. We are making waves, even though the media is continuing to gaslight us and make us feel like, that we're not. But I do believe that we're making waves, and we're even seeing corporate media outlets completely change the way that they're covering Gaza. I don't know if you guys remember Clarissa Ward, CNN's main correspondent covering Israel and Palestine. Well, she had been approached by many activists while she was at the Rafah border for not showing the brutality of Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza. And today, finally, she's in Gaza. She has entered Gaza. And, you know, I don't really believe the tears that are falling down her face, to be honest with you, because she kind of became a laughing stock of correspondence for CNN when she, on camera, was ducking from a supposed Hamas missile when really nothing had happened. And now she's like in these Gaza hospitals crying. And I just don't believe it. I don't believe her tears. I think that they are crocodile tears, and I think that she's lying. But I think that she was pressured into this position to show just the humanity of people in Gaza. And at the end of the day, when this war is over, she'll probably be one of those journalists receiving an award for her coverage at the correspondence dinner in Washington, D.C., while Israel has massacred over 85 journalists. And by the way, we found that article. Alan was so kind to find it for us. So we're just going to post it here as just another example of media propaganda. This article is from Politico, and it was literally published about a full week after the White House retracted Biden's statement that he saw the beheaded babies, and they said that they could not confirm that there were ever beheaded babies. So the title is, Israel is acting proportionately against a terrorist enemy. So long as Hamas uses civilian locations for the purpose of planning, carrying out, and executing attacks against Israel, they become legitimate military targets. And by the way, the idea that Hamas uses human shields has also been debunked and proven inaccurate by the likes of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch themselves. In fact, they've actually documented that it is Israel who uses human shields. But I'll get to that point in just a second. But if you read the first line of this article, it states, before the bodies of the 40 Jewish babies massacred by Hamas were even buried, many self-proclaimed activists were already charging Israel with acting disproportionately in response to the attacks on October 7th. And so this article is about proportionate and disproportionate response by Israel. And obviously, this article goes on to justify Israel's bombings in Gaza that, let's just say 40 babies were beheaded. Let's just say, how does that compare to 10,000 children now killed in Gaza?
And just to say, just to jump in, that article, I don't like shooting the messenger too often, but that article is written by quote unquote human rights lawyer Arsen Ostrovsky, who the less said about him, the better. But the fact is, if you Google him, the first thing that Google suggests is Arsen Ostrovsky cartoon. And he posted an extremely incendiary cartoon that went viral around the world that showed Palestinians as cockroaches underneath a boot of the IDF soldier that was stamping the cockroach out. So that's really where he's coming from. But I think Mickey, you wanted to jump in and say something there?
Well, always, Alan, but that was a fantastic point. And I think that while I believe that it's proper to not technically focus on the person or attack the person, certainly looking at the motives, the perspectives, the biases, the motivations, the funding sources. I mean, this is all critical media literacy 101. This is why we need this. It's not just the public that needs critical media literacy education. It's our journalists, many of whom are just surprised when they hear these kinds of stories coming from independent media, that it couldn't possibly be true, because otherwise their intrepid people on the ground would have reported it. Even Reuters, whose reporters are being killed and targeted, right? Just like they were in Iraq, just like the WikiLeaks files showed us, right? Manar, coming back to your question about that earlier. But Alan, I also wanted to just touch very quickly on the theme of atrocity propaganda as tied to the global military industrial surveillance complex, because all of what Israel is doing is possible with the IDF. It's possible because of the massive funding and support, umbrella support of the United States and other Western allies. Not only is the media playing a major role in the atrocity propaganda to kind of set the stage for this questioning of, is it a disproportionate attack, right? That's the gaslighting part of it, the questioning, that is that really the term? Are these presidents anti-Semitic? Is there a growing problem on college campuses? Those are all really interesting and important things, but they're not the actual topic and issue at hand now, are they? Which is what's happening in Gaza and what's happening in the Middle East. But none of this would matter if the Israelis didn't also have blank checks and unabated weapons flowing into that country so that they can use it for these purposes. And I wanted to just point out that not only does the United States spend $3 to $6 billion a year officially to the state of Israel, much of that in the form of weapons. Biden was just calling to send that amount or more. We've also sent some tens of thousands of other kinds of munitions and things since October 7. The European Union, which likes to sort of sometimes set itself apart from the United States with its wanton militarism and imperialistic tendencies, the EU was bragging that it likes to talk about how it supports Palestine. So according to the recent figures from last year, they gave $111 million to the cause of people in Palestine. But out of the $220 billion that the EU spent on weapons, $3.6 billion went to Israel. So you've got a little over 100 million going for humanitarian aid for the Palestinians. And then you got 3.6 billion in weapons that guarantees that 111 million won't be enough to address the humanitarian crisis that they're actively creating.
Yeah. Well, and that 11 million you mentioned that goes to the Palestinians, it typically goes to the Palestinian Authority.
Yes.
Which is a government that works literally hand in hand with the Israeli government. I mean, the Palestinian Authority opens up the gates to the West Bank for Israeli soldiers to enter, to go into, to raid Jenin, to raid the refugee camps.
And Menard, fewer journalists have done the work that Alan McLeod has done to expose the revolving door between the military-industrial surveillance complex worldwide with the U.S., the major U.S. intelligence agencies, the IDF in the U.K., again, that work is incredibly important. In fact, it made the top list of our censored stories this year, which, again, we think that this kind of reporting is the kind of reporting that is out there that more people need access to. More people simply need to be aware that all of these kind of things are happening. And again, I think it's important to mention, I know the people watching this are aware of Mint Press News behind the headlines. They are probably also aware of Electronic Intifada and the work of Rania Khalek and Abby Martin and Mondo Weiss and so on. But it's really important to get the word out about these other media platforms, Manar, because the information is available. It's just, you really have to sift through so much. And there is a lot of propaganda and a lot of atrocity propaganda. And so we have to be very careful about what we're going to repeat. And we have to be careful to check our information. And the corporate media just really hasn't been really good at that because they don't have to be. No,
and I would like us to talk a little bit about the work that Alan has done that has made it to your book through Mint Press. I mean, I've said this to Alan, and I think we all feel this, but he is, in my opinion, one of the most important journalists of our decade, of our time. And he has really gone above and beyond at exposing this revolving door between big tech and the weapons manufacturers and the intelligence agencies in a way that really hasn't been exposed. And so can you tell us, Mickey, what story made it to the top 10 censored list from Alan? And then maybe Alan, you can tell us, we can wrap up from there. You can, Alan, tell us about the story, but please tell us about the one that made it to your book. Was it one or more than one? I guess
right now, there's certainly the one that I'm looking at right here is our second story that I had riffed on earlier. It's the hiring of former CIA employees and ex-Israeli agents blurs the line between big tech and Big Brother. That's our number 2 story in our new book that just came out last week that Alan wrote the foreword for about media, and it's an incredibly great foreword. One of our former students who now works with us, Reagan Haney at Loyola Marymount, researched the story because we teach media literacy while we're reviewing all of these. It went through our entire process on a ballot of over 100 stories and was selected by our judges, about 30 different judges, to be our number 2 story. And that's out of a lot of stories, Manar. But this story is, again, I think one of the more significant ones because it shows, these are 2 of Alan's stories. National Security Search Engine, Google ranks are filled with CIA agents, and revealed the former Israeli spies working the top jobs at Google, Facebook, and Microsoft. It's because of intrepid reporters like Alan, who has an academic background in media studies and media literacy, that he's able to merge those worlds together and tell the public, in the great words of George Seldes in the 20th century, to tell the public what's really going on so they can be meaningfully civically engaged and agitate for real change and real justice.
Well,
Alan,
I feel like I'm getting far too much praise for just what I consider to be kind of basic reporting, actually. Just doing the job that any journalist should as well. And I want to also, before going through this, I also want to thank Colleen for her help on those stories, because she was actually an expert witness and a commenter on some of those, specifically about Facebook. But yeah, for those stories, if people haven't checked them out, there's a whole range of them. And what I did was, again, I don't think this is particularly groundbreaking. I just was one day on the social media website LinkedIn, which is an employment website. I went there and started, doing basic searches like Microsoft IDF or TikTok NATO or Google CIA. And the amount of current employees at these big media organizations and big social media organizations that had just years ago, or even in some cases weeks ago, been working at organizations like the FBI, the NSA, or the CIA was absolutely astounding. And really, it was from there that I started to just look into this and found a gigantic network of spooks and spies that are now very overtly running our biggest media platforms that are far more powerful and influential than anything that the New York Times or Fox News can say, specifically because they reach people in every country in the world. Facebook has 3 billion unique monthly users, which is somewhere close to 50% of the adult population of the entire world. And when you look at who is ultimately in charge of deciding what is allowed and what is not allowed on Facebook, what they censor and what they promote, the guy is, somebody who until 2019 was actually in the CIA writing the president's daily brief for President Obama and President Trump. So this is the sort of connections that we're seeing, to the point where it's very hard to see what the difference between fourth estate and the deep state is, really, when we get down to it. And this is something that we have to talk about, bringing it back to Gaza as well. When we're seeing accounts constantly that show the Palestinian side of the story here getting constantly demonetized, delisted, demoted, and in some cases even deleted as well, that is no accident that is happening to one side and not the other. And on every issue, it seems that those who challenge entrenched power get penalized on social media, and those who uphold power are promoted. That's clearly not a coincidence. And this has been going on for a number of years now.
Absolutely. And this concludes our live stream today. And I want to thank you all for joining us. I know Colleen had to dip out because she has another interview that she's doing right now. So, if we can leave everybody with something, it's, we have to put our support behind independent journalists and journalism, and the independent activists who are really risking everything, their reputations, and sometimes literally their lives to bring out this information to the public eye. We are up against a Goliath, a machine, a propaganda machine, and a corporate media that works in tandem with the direct support of think tanks that are funded by the state of Israel, like the Atlantic Council, with weapons manufacturers. So they have a clear agenda to keep the military industrial complex going. It needs to keep fueling these wars so that they can line the pockets of these executives with more profits. I mean, that's really what this is all about at the end of the day. And so, just to wrap it up, Mint Press News' YouTube channel was demonetized recently. And so we'd appreciate any financial support. These live streams are funded through, are supported by our Patreon. And so we'd appreciate any support from our viewers to become a member on our Patreon. We've nearly doubled our members on Patreon in the last 2 months, which has shown us that our readers and viewers are very much supportive and appreciative of our work. And I think just this flood of propaganda has just been disheartening. And so people are reminded once again to not rely on corporate media for their information. But that is all. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me today. And until next time. All right, I'm going to end here.
Thanks, Minar.
Thank you.